Ashe family, welcome back to another episode of My Unapologetic Perspective. This is the podcast where we give our point of view on controversial topics from my experience, black history, and our knowledge as African Americans. Black history presently lives in us so we can continue to excel into the future. It's one thing to know black history, it's another thing to take advantage of what the people in black history did for you. I am your host, Martre Baker Stevens, and to the right of me is Shaquan Battle.
What up?
And to the right of him is Jerome Battle.
What's up?
Appreciate all the love and support we still been getting. Means more to us than it could be anybody else. Where would y'all like to start? What are we doing today? What y'all want to talk about? We starting with racism? We're going with black history? What are we doing? Politics? What are we talking about?
I got a question. Did now, well, back then and now, so growing up and now, did cultural differences play a role in who you dated?
You talking about back then? So when you talk about back then, you're talking about us as teenagers or young men.
So in high school, the reason why I never really dated white girls is because I seen a black guy date a white girl from the time they was in middle school to high school, and then once they got to high school, the mom didn't approve of it, and they had been dating for like 3 or 4 years, and they had to separate ways because he was black.
Right.
And it's something we talk about all the time in the barbershop is like you don't want a girlfriend where you have to explain the Martin joke to her. Like you just want her to be able to get it.
Yeah, I think eventually you grow into that. You want somebody that's more like-minded that understands you, especially when you start going through stuff. Somebody that could console you and be able to understand what it is that you're going through and why you're going through what you're going through. Because a lot of times, some of it may have to do with race.
Right.
But as a teenager, it's not something that you were really thinking about. Let's be honest. We was only thinking about a couple things back then. You know what I'm saying? How she looked and how and what I wanted from that person and whatever the case may be. Now, there's been people who've been able to connect with somebody that's culturally different from them and they have a wonderful life. More power to them. But for me, as I got older, I started to understand what it is that I needed as a man, as a black man in this in this world, and a black woman was the best suitor for me.
I've never dated. I've never dated outside of my race. Never been attracted to any females outside of my race. So it's a little different for me. The other thing is I was also at the point, even as a teenager, that I believe I was too pro-black for any white person to want to even deal with me on a day-to-day basis. They would get tired of hearing that shit from me every day. You know, at some point they would think, "Is you talking to me?" Yeah. So I don't think that would ever work for me back then, and it certainly wouldn't work for me now. Is that, you know, culturally, I just don't think there's anything in terms of attraction for a black male than a black female. I don't think there's anything more attractive. And I'm not knocking the people that did it, that they have their reasons, whatever those reasons are. I would hope that people are attracted to people based on people, not race.
Right.
Especially nowadays, I think that's becoming more prevalent. Even to some degrees we may disagree with on this podcast, but obviously I think it has its time now a lot easier than it was previously, because before, I mean, there were certain things that you couldn't do. Not just in this country, but in a lot of countries. So people from my era and even before me probably had a different set of reasons why they did or didn't.
So in DC growing up, did you see a lot of white females?
I didn't see a lot of white people at all. You know, I tell people the story that, you know, there was 2 white people that probably lived in our school district, and they was referred to as the white man, and we had 1 white kid that went to our school was referred as the white boy. And you know who it was. His real name was Robert. But people would refer to him as that because everybody would know who he was, because he was the only one. We only saw a majority of the white people we saw was on Sundays when the Washington Redskins at the time played at home at RFK Stadium, because we live right up the street. And then we in between where we lived and where RFK Stadium was, there's the Armory. So you would see military personnel from time to time. that could be white. But other than that, on TV, Subway, that was pretty much it.
I don't know if we ever discussed it on this podcast or not. I know you told us when you first heard I forgot what song it was. But what was your first when you first seen a white person outside of the neighborhood? Or did Granddad have conversations with y'all before?
Oh, he used to talk to us all the time about the cultural differences between us and them. I would think when I began to understand was through my Uncle Jeff. And I don't want to tell a whole lot of personal stories, but my Uncle Jeff always dated white women that, you know, as far as I know, when we became old enough to understand what that meant. And it was a cultural difference, but it wasn't bad.
Right.
Everybody that my Uncle Jeff dated, including who he married, were just good people.
Right.
And where you could understand a little bit of that concept of where people say they don't see color.
Right.
Because I don't think at the time that the women that he dated really saw color. At least they didn't treat us that way.
Right.
You know, so I think that was probably my first experience in really meeting and talking to, because, you know, obviously my aunt Judy was one of the first white women that I really had a in-depth conversation with when I was younger. So I would think that was my first experience. Outside of that, other than just when we moved here, a lot of the people that, of course, in the classrooms that I were in were all white. So at some point you had to converse with them unless you wanted to be an outcast, which I didn't. I don't feel like I was an outcast, even though I was black and I was the only black in those classes. It was uncomfortable in those situations. And I don't think that people intended to make me feel uncomfortable. I think that they were just as uncomfortable having a black kid in their class as I was being uncomfortable being the only black in the class.
Right.
Doesn't make it easy for either one of us. But also the fact that I wasn't from here complicated things for them, because I didn't talk like them. I didn't think like them. I didn't dress like them. I didn't even talk and dress like other black people. So in that sense, I was entirely different. So I wasn't just not white. I was also not from here. So it made it a little bit awkward in both situations. So even when I lived in the city, moving back and forth and having characteristics of people from Virginia when you go back to the north, and then being different in that sense, it was always awkward for me as a kid.
That's why I used to tell Bake and D-Rob all the time, once we got to high school, I wish I was like them, because they were the lone black kids in the classes where probably they were the only black kids in, but yet they still looked like us, they talked like us, but yet they were still in those classes where it might have been just Bake and D-Rob as the lone black people.
Yeah, so what happened is that most of the time you got placed based on some type of placement test, or the courses that you took and the grades that you made. So a lot of times, because I was above average in at least in a placement test or aptitude test, or even just the grades that I was making, I was in more advanced classes where we know historically black kids aren't in those classes. Same thing back then is the same thing now. And a lot of that is by design. Obviously, and we've talked about this before, and I touched on it in the last podcast, is a lot of funding is based on kids passing. When you have a high percentage of kids passing, whether it's SOLs or just passing to the next grade, that's more federal funding or even state funding for those school systems. They really care less about the student. It's about the money. So they would make sure that they only had kids of minority in those classes that they felt comfortable with passing. If they didn't think you could pass them, that's why sometimes your guidance counselor would try to not discourage you from taking those harder classes, because they really wanted you to pass. Not because they didn't think you could, but if they weren't quite sure, they would try to discourage you from it, because obviously their federal funding and state funding was based on the number of kids that would pass these classes.
One of my topics actually coexist with what you just talked about and what you just talked about. Especially one thing you said when you said that you weren't from here and you didn't even dress like the other black people here. The last episode I talked about how race is important in this country and how the history of racism. And I got on white people about, the racist history. But today I want to get on somebody else because when you talk about culture, in the mixed race in this country, I believe it is important. My man called me earlier this week. Shout out to Jack Baker, friend of the show. He called me and was like, yo, I've been doing like some research and like all of the successful black people like inventors or scientists that I Google, do you notice that they're removing the word African and American from a lot of the sites? So when you Google Lewis Latimer and you click on Wikipedia, I know Wikipedia is not a valid source that you should use, but it's the first thing that always pop up whenever you Google, and most people are going to click on that Wikipedia site just to get a base analysis of what it is that they're looking for. But it literally says Lewis Latimer, American inventor, not African and American inventor. Now, I know people like Morgan Freeman has made the statements that he doesn't want to be called African and American or Black American. He just want to be an American. And I understand that from one perspective, but from the other perspective, as we talked about last week, that there is a history of race in this country, and that race is important principle in this country because of the history. So when you remove the word African and American or Black American from somebody, it minimizes the accomplishment they had in spite of that we talk about, the accomplishments that they had in spite of. Because if you look at Lewis Latimer from another white American inventor, it's going to look totally different, because a lot of black inventors that we talked about on this podcast, their patents were either not taken seriously or stolen from them or not given credit for because of the fact that they was black. So you can't correlate the two together when it comes to black and white people. So that's why having that word African American or Black American is important, because if you don't talk about what they done as black people, then they'll discredit us altogether whenever we do something to say this is not in your culture or your repertoire to be able to do this. And I've seen a lot of interviews, and one recently was Kai Cenat talk about how Black Americans don't have any culture. And that's one of the most disrespectful things that you can say to us, because I know there are a lot of immigrants that come here from Jamaica or Haiti or Brazil, who also came along on the transatlantic slave trade and went through slavery and have their own stories. But when they come to America, they disrespect us as if we don't have culture, right? But everything about them when they get here appropriates our culture. And I'm not disrespecting them. I'm Pan-African all day. I got number love for all my black people across the world. But when you talk about foundational Black Americans, I'm that too. And I have love for what our ancestors endured here in this country and what they accomplished here in this country. And here's my point. When you look at the definition of culture, here's two working definitions. The arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. It's also the custom, arts, social institution, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. So to say that Black Americans don't have culture is to say that we haven't achieved anything. We don't have any social institutions, and we don't have any customs. That's totally incorrect. Right. Yes, when we got transported here, we probably lost more our Africanness than anybody else. Jamaica kept a lot of theirs. Haiti kept a lot of theirs. Brazil kept a lot of theirs. Places like South Carolina, they kept a lot of theirs when you looked at the Gullah Geechee. But for the most part, all of us, it is lost in translation. We don't have most of the customs that we had from Africa, right? So on that plantation, we created our own culture. That's right. When you look at music, you can't talk about any music genre because we created all of that shit. We're not just hip hop. We created country. We created rock and roll. We created jazz. We created gospel. All the things that influence not just music, but it influenced everything globally. Right? When you look at the fashion, they talk about the hip hop fashion. The sneaker culture. Everywhere I go is sneaker culture now. You got little white kids who 10, 11 years old, and the first thing they look at now is when you walk in the door, what kind of shoes my man got on. That used to be a black thing, right? Now it's, and I'm not disregarding the little white boy with the cool shoes. That's dope. That they embodying our culture in American culture, because we created whatever we say is hot. It's hot. Remember when we was in school, we was all wearing the Air Force Ones, right? My man came up from Atlanta. He was wearing Filas. And everybody was like, yo, why you got on Filas? He was like, yo, this is what we were in Atlanta. So when you said that people don't dress like the way that you dressed when you came from D.C., even within our states, within our cities, Black American culture changes, right?
That's right.
Detroit were the buffs. You know what I'm saying? Chicago and New York, they don't talk alike. They don't dress alike. The music is different. Even Northern Virginia and Southern Virginia, we'll tell you we not like them. And they'll say they not like us.
That's right.
DC and Maryland, they'll say, hey, look, we from Maryland. We not from DC. We totally different from each other. By the way that we dress and by the way that we talk, that's culture. That's foundational Black American culture.
That's right.
Our art, right? When you look at the Harlem Renaissance, it opened up the floodgates for authors globally to tell their perspective.
That's right.
And bring it to white America's doorstep. When Alan Locke and Zora Hurston and Langston Hughes began to write in the form and the which way they was right, that we see people together today able to write books, and the English is different. It's our English. Zora Hurston, Their Eyes Was Watching God is one of the hardest books to read because she used the dialect of the people in Florida to say, yo, I have to be able to translate what it is that they're saying. That's foundational Black American shit, right? When you look at film is huge, right? Because people like Oscar Michaud from Illinois, who produced more than 44 films, he opened up the floodgates for Black filmmakers to say, we're going to make Black movies with Black stories for Black actors and Black actresses, the way that we want to tell a story. That paved the way for people like, what's my man name from Snowfall? Damson Idris. Damson Idris to come here and sit in California to learn how they talk.
And so my man on All American.
My man on All American. Idris Elba, who did The Wire. You got to go to Baltimore to learn how to talk like that.
That's right.
For you to be able to make millions of dollars acting like a foundational Black American, right? We are the motherfucking coach. If you look at overseas players, you look in Africa, you look in Asia, you look at all of these places that play basketball, they move like the NBA players, right? The moves that they make, the celebration of the NBA players, you learn that on the playground right here in foundational Black America. Like you can't. Everybody talks in African American vernacular English now. Like at first they was like, yo, those are ghetto words. Those are urban dictionary words. You know what I'm saying? Street words. That's us, man. You can't. And when you look at, I know they don't teach it a lot in school, but when you look at people like Granville T. Woods, Lewis Latimer that I mentioned, Benjamin Banneker, you look at the civil rights movement that transitioned to Europe and they had their own civil rights movement. Right. When you look at the accomplishments that we've had in this country that help move other countries further along, like you can't disrespect what Black Americans have done. Not African American, Black Americans, foundational Black Americans, what they done right here in this culture. Everybody watches us to say, hey, what are they about to do? How do they handle this situation? That's no disrespect to nobody from Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil. But we know y'all got your own culture. It's lovely. We respect it. But when you come here, you make sure you pay homage, because the opportunity that you get here is because of us. It's the reason why you want to come to America. That's right. And the reason why you want to come to America is because our people here paved the way for you to be able to do so.
The crazy part about that is I don't know if I know Kai is from New York.
He's from New York, but he got Jamaican ancestry.
Right. So my thing with that would be, let's take the Twitch app, the live streaming app, right? Him and Duke Dennis are the biggest when it comes to live streaming, and Duke Dennis is from here, and he runs AMP, and Kai is under AMP. So I don't get what Kai was saying with
everybody that's on Kai's stream is a foundational Black American.
Right. He just had Kevin Hart on there.
You make your money off that. the way that you dress, the way that you talk, it may be certain words that you use that you just heard in New York.
Right.
It's foundational Black American shit, bro. The music that you talk about, the hip hop music, that's foundational Black American. Like stop. Like, I understand that other people come here and they look down on us a little bit because a lot of immigrants come here and they do better than some of our people. But don't disrespect us. Like, we do what we do, and we influence the world.
I feel like that should have came at the end of the podcast.
I do feel like the pod about the end.
That interview Jay-Z gave when he was on tour with DMX, and he was the show, and so he came on after DMX, and he said DMX went on, the crowd going crazy, and he growling, and taking off his shirt and then praying, and then he come on like, it's the hard knock. Gotta feel like that after that.
Nah, because it went along to what y'all was talking about. I had it for the end, but it went along to what y'all was talking about.
He used the third verse for the first verse is what he did.
That should be it, you know. But you know, the thing is when you start removing African American from people historically have accomplished in this country, it's for a reason. And we talked about it from day one on this podcast. If anybody been following us, if you remember the very first episodes, and for those that are new, welcome. Go back and look at some of those first episodes where we talked about those early on images when you're a kid, 5-year-old going to school for the very first time. What pictures of American heroes are on that wall at your local school?
It's the same ones.
It's the same ones. And most of the time, the only ones that are going to be Black are going to be Martin Luther King and maybe Frederick Douglass. Maybe. Just
probably Harriet Tubman before
Harriet
Frederick
Tubman,
Douglass.
maybe, depending on where you live. Again, this is about living in different areas. In D.C., we may have saw Benjamin Banneker, where people down here didn't even know who Benjamin Banneker was. Yeah. So those early images. And I'm gonna try to remember something real quick, and you guys may remember this. Back when President Obama first ran for presidency in Harlem, during the election, they gave a standardized test to the kids in Harlem, and 86% of the kids that took that test failed. And when Barack won presidency, they were going to retest the kids, but they were gonna retool them, do some tutoring. They decided, let's don't do that. Let's don't retutor them. Let's don't give them any new knowledge. Let's don't do anything. Let's just give them the same test again, and let's see how they fare. And they did that. 95% of that 86% that failed the first time passed. What changed? Well, when you have a new president that looked like you, it gave you two things. It gave you hope, and it gave you that imagery that you need that Black people can be successful in this country. Right. So just having that image allowed those kids the confidence that they needed to be able to perform well in the test environment. And those are the kind of things that we need.
And we are back. Sorry about that. My camera cut off. Pops, you can keep going.
Yeah. Just to kind of talk a little bit about same concept is that, you know, people of color are constantly being taught, being programmed to believe that we don't matter, or we matter less than white Americans. The system, the entire system, including the government, its design and structure, its functionality, its laws and policies promote, perpetuate, and protect those concepts to the point that we either begin to believe them, live by them, live with them. Then sometimes we assist them in that agenda by teaching our kids to do the same, even subconsciously or indirectly. I'm gonna go off script just for a second. I vividly remember that there was a test that was done using monkeys, and I'm gonna use this as a good example because they often refer to us as monkeys. And anyway, is that the experiment included 5 monkeys they put in a room, and they hung a banana from the top. And every time a monkey would climb up to try to get the banana, they would spray them with water. They would spray all 5 of them with water. And that would happen every time a monkey would climb up and try to get the banana. After a while, when one monkey would climb up and try to get the banana, the other 4 would attack him and beat him up. Right? And then, and there would be nobody sprayed with water.
See where you going.
They would then remove one monkey and replace it with a new monkey.
Well, the new monkey would get in and he would climb up, try to get the banana, and the other 4 would grab him, bring him down, beat him up. And they would replace monkey after monkey till eventually all 5 monkeys were replaced. But every time one monkey went up to grab the banana, the other 4 would grab him and pull him down. When in fact, none of those 5 monkeys had ever been sprayed with the water.
Mm-hmm.
So they were just following suit as to what happened and what was taught to them without ever knowing what the consequences of that would be.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I feel like that's exactly what they're doing to us, to the point that we've been doing it so long and we've been teaching our kids how to live with it so long that we don't even know what the true consequences are. We don't know what the truth really is because we've been living the lie for so long. We're not even concerned. We thought that was the truth. Mm-hmm. Now we're starting to find out the truth, and most people are afraid of it. The truth is most white America are the ones that are afraid of the truth. Mm-hmm. And they should be. Not because we want to take something from them. It's because we only want, as James Brown said, we want what's ours.
Afraid of the truth getting out.
Exactly.
It's funny that you said that about the monkeys. Another one that I like is the crabs in the bucket, right? Because when crabs are in the bucket and the steam gets going and it gets hot and crab tries to go up to the top and all the other crabs pull them down. And I heard somebody say one time, well, that's because the crabs are not in their natural habitat. They're not in their right environment. So if you put them in the environment that they're supposed to be in, they don't act like that. That's why when you put them in an environment where it's survival of the fittest, of course, all of them are going to pull them back down. But Memorial Day is tomorrow, right? And it's when we release this episode, it'll be Memorial Day. And the first National Memorial Day is reported as May 30th, 1868. However, foundational Black Americans began honoring fallen soldiers back in May of 1865. It is believed that in South Carolina, that the first Memorial Day celebration happened. Now, there's disputes about where it was first, but we can say that African Americans contributed to the celebration of what we call Memorial Day today. Because in South Carolina, newly freed African Americans that fought in the Civil War adorned the soldiers and began to go to their graves in 1865, making it one of the first Memorial Days recorded. In fact, when they did they gathered around an old racetrack, and about 10,000 formerly enslaved African Americans and some white people, some school children and Black religious leaders began to be there to honor the Black soldiers. They even had some Black battalions there to march and to hand out flowers. And then in 1868, they made it a real holiday to basically celebrate Memorial Day. And of course, the concept behind it was to place flowers on the graves of fallen soldiers. So Black Americans, again, with our culture, has influenced the rest of the world. And when we talk about Memorial Day, again, we talked about on this podcast before that you can't talk about any war that happened in this country without mentioning Black people volunteering, participating, right, dying for this country. So when people say that when we don't stand for the flag, that it's disrespect for the soldiers, nah, negative, sir. Y'all can't get away with that because we have our ancestors who fought for this country. But we talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, right? The Red Tails on this podcast before, who were young men that volunteered to be the first Black military airmen who flew over 15,000 sorties in World War II and created and gained a lot of respect and was called upon a lot because of their ability to move in the air. Then you had the 369th Infantry that we talked about, the Harlem Hellfighters of World War I, who spent 191 days in the trenches on the front line, longer than anybody else during that war. And we know that France nicknamed them Men of Bronze, who they never lost a trench and they never lost a man to capture. But one of the ones that we haven't talked about was in 1944, Mary Bethune talked to Eleanor Roosevelt for a role for Black women in the war overseas. and they came up with they call it the 6888, the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion. And they was a predominantly black battalion in Women's Army Corps, led by Major Charity Adams, who was the first African-American Army officer in the Women's Army Corps. And by the end of the war, she was the highest ranking African-American. And even she faced her challenges. They told her at one time, she was outspoken. They told her at one time, we're going to bring a white person down here to show you how to run this battalion. And she said, over my dead body. So she was very outspoken in what she did. But most of the 688th or the 6888 worked as postal clerks. Some of them were cooks, some of them were mechanics. So they were a self-sufficient unit. And then they went across seas. And they were the first African-American women to go across seas during the war. And the reason why they went across seas is because Army officials believed that the male backup was hurting the morale in the war. So back then, when people were sending mail to soldiers, it was 2 or 3 years behind in getting to people or not getting to them at all, is because they would just put the first name, or they would put the first and last name, but it'd be so many different people with the name like John Carter or John Clark or something like that. Or they would put their nickname, to the point where they didn't have any idea what some of this mail went to. And it was millions, 17 million items that was backlogged. So they sent these women over here, these black women over there, to help get this mail out to increase the morale during the war, so they can be able to win the war. My coach used to say this, shout out to Coach Kaner. He used to say the General Patton line, that certain things like warm socks and a warm meal was what won the war. So not having mail was a huge contributor to losing the war, because a lot of people weren't hearing from home. They were down. They didn't understand the importance of what they was doing. So being reminded through that from loved ones through letters helped boost morale, to the point where I got to get back home. So we need to win this war, right? So this black battalion, the 6888, worked 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week, to begin to get this mail out to the soldiers to boost morale. And they touched over 60, each person touched about 65,000 pieces of mail. And they handled over 4 million military and civilian mail that was cleared through backlog, probably about 6 months earlier than they were supposed to finish. And then these women were segregated. They had to experience racism and sexism from being over there with the male soldiers. Of course, they talked about being treated by civilians in London or in France better than they were treated in America. That's right. Even in Paris after the war, they had a parade for them in Paris where people admired them. They celebrated them. And when they got back to America, nobody talked about them. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until a few years ago to where people even acknowledged the 6888, who went through so much and contributed to this country and should be honored on Memorial Day. And I told that story is because Tyler Perry is supposedly working on a movie.
A couple of people.
Netflix is doing a documentary that's supposed to drop this year on the 6888. So I advise everybody to check that out. Don't know what Tyler Perry is going to go with the story. You kind of.
It's going to be loosely based.
Yeah, it'll be Hollywood. Hollywood. You know, it's going to be some black trauma. It's going to be some stereotypical stuff in there. But just take the story for what it is, for what these black women had to face and had to go through while being in service, because they were important to the reason why we were successful in World War II.
Did it talk about how they went through all of that mail?
It didn't. So that's been a lot of there's not been a lot of research done. They do have stories from those women. That's why I'm really excited to hear from the stories whenever they do the documentary, to hear about what they had to go through in doing this mail. But just because they weren't out there shooting a gun doesn't mean that they wasn't important to the military or the army or whatever. It's an important thing to acknowledge.
Absolutely.
Y'all got anything else?
One last thing, just a reminder about the election. Just want to keep people in tune. For the people that want some guidance on what they should be reading and looking for, I would ask people do some research, and I want everybody to do some research on Ronald Reagan. And I want you to see how similar Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump is.
Reaganomics.
And I want people to think about, for people that are, younger than the age of 50, you could probably ask your parents about the 80s, the early 80s, about how things were in the United States for Black Americans under Reaganomics. It is a huge concept that's often forgot about nowadays, but when it comes to what they call social programs, so that'll be anything like welfare, subsidized housing, anything that help poor people, and in most cases, Black poor people, would come through that sector called social programs. And in those social programs, Ronald Reagan stopped a lot of that funding that went to social programs and used that money for other things. And there's a host of other things that money was used for that did not benefit Black people, and in some cases negatively impacted Black people, as if, for example, creating military bases in residential areas that were highly populated by the Black community. Little things like that obviously impacts the property value of where those residents live, that would not allow them to continue to live in those areas. The rhetoric from Ronald Reagan is very similar to, if not, it's almost like Donald Trump just took a page right out of Ronald Reagan's book in terms of the politics that he's spewing and the way that he's spewing it.
For sure. I got one more thing. Going back to the last episode, I said this on the last episode, but it had to get cut because for some reason stuff just didn't record right on the last episode, but it was important, so I'm gonna say it again. When you talk about these TV series or movies that are coming out, which are Black horror genres, it's important because, as I told Pops on this podcast, that I thought the Emmett Till movie should have been a horror movie, because that's exactly what it was. It was a horror story. It was a real life American horror story for Black America.
That's right.
And when we look at the history of Black history here in this country, a lot of it is a horror story. Yep. And you don't need a make-believe Jason Voorhees. You don't need a Mike Myers. You don't need a made-up creature. We know who the antagonist is in Black history when it comes to a lot of these horror stories that we talk about. And I just love the fact that we're getting a lot of this on TV. When you talk about what Jordan Peele did with Get Out and what he did with Us, and what we got with Lovecraft Country, what we got with 2 seasons of Them, the show The Other Black Girl, the movie Master. I didn't like this movie, but if you liked it, the movie Antebellum. When you're talking about Black people and the trauma that they've had to go through in this country and still going through this country, that a lot of it is due to racism or sexism and all of these other things, it's important to tell these stories, even if they make other people feel uncomfortable, right? Even if it seems like it's rhetoric, because it was rhetoric and it still is rhetoric. So we have to begin to continue to tell these stories, because stuff like redlining, it wasn't the fact that Black people couldn't afford to live in these neighborhoods. It's because you didn't want them to live in these neighborhoods, and you terrorized these people, as they showed on the episode of Lovecraft Country and a lot on season 2 of Them. When you talk about the horror stories of being the only Black person in the office or being the only Black person in the school, like that's a real life horror story to us, right? We have to deal with that on a regular basis. And I believe it's important to tell those stories. I got one more thing. It is give them their flowers. I haven't done this in a few episodes. One of my favorite movies back in the day, for the young people who don't remember, when you used to go into the movie store and you find a movie that you love, and you rent it out for 2 days before you have to take it back, was The 5 Heartbeats. It's one of my favorite movies, and
I think that is your favorite.
Yeah, that one. And I got to give my flowers to Robert Townsend for what he was able to do. And Keenan Wayans, who also was a part of this original story. But for Robert Townsend, when you look at what he did with Hollywood Shuffle and how he talked about the stereotypes that was going on in Hollywood for Black people, how they wanted Black people to play these stereotypical roles. And he captured that through comedy in this movie to bring awareness about what they had to go through in Hollywood. When you look at movies like The Meteor Man, which was one of the first Black superhero movies that we got in our generation. Parenthood, 2-parent household show that he produced with children. One of those shows. But when you look at the 5 Heartbeats, and I didn't realize until I watched the documentary on the making of the 5 Heartbeats, and when he talked about how him and Keenan Wayans wanted to write this script to talk about what happened with groups like the Temptations. Why did they break up? Why did we lose this pure Blackness of friendship and music? And when they began to tell a story, and then they went through the media, and the media was like, hey, we like the story, but we don't think other people will want to hear this story, the 5 Heartbeats. And of course, Keenan Ivory Wayans. Yeah, but Keenan Ivory Wayans from Jamie Foxx. You think Keenan Ivory Wayans, don't you, boy? Of course, Keenan Wayans go on to do In Living Color, which left Robert Townsend with this script that he thought was perfect. So he went to somebody else went to a new agent, and finally they found a place to where, hey, we can be able to make this movie, but it's going to be on a limited budget. And one of the things I didn't know is that he wanted Denzel to play Eddie Kane Jr. and Denzel wanted to play that part, but at the time Denzel was up for an Oscar, to the point where it was like, well, we're not going to be able to get Denzel now. He's for that money. He's going to cost too much. So he also wanted to get Whitney Houston to play Baby Doll, and they went to Whitney Houston, and Whitney Houston was like, how much I'm going to be able to sing in this movie? He told her, and her father told her he'll get back to her, and they came back and they was like, she's not going to be able to do it. So you just look at what the casting could have been, but he was able to make do to go get these beautiful up and coming actors. And when you look at the auditions, Don Cheadle, all of these people auditioned for these parts, but he had a role in mind he wanted to create a brotherhood from this group. And of course they got the people that they wanted to get. They got the shots that they wanted to take. And of course, as the movie went on, they shot it. They had a little turmoil within the movie. They was over the budget, so they couldn't spend any more money. But when the movie came out in theaters, the movie came out the same time as New Jack City. And New Jack City pretty much had a shooting in the theater, so nobody was going to see any Black movies. And then when they did the trailer, it didn't really capture what the movie was about, so nobody was going to see the movie. But people who watched it, people like Whitney Houston was like, oh my God, I shouldn't have turned down that part. I wish I could have did it. Denzel's like, yo, you still should have called me. I would have did it. They gave great reviews about it. And I brought up the movie store because it didn't become successful until it hit the movie stores. Mm-hmm. And it became an instant classic once people got to see the movie. And one of the things that the actors talked about is how people came up to them talking about how the movie is important because it's a group of Black men who had their turmoil, had their success, had their turmoil, and in the end of the movie, they came back together where they put their hands in together, and it's that brotherhood that 5 successful Black men can overcome anything and still give love to each other. Right. You go back to the part where Eddie Kane, he goes through what he goes through, and then at the end of the movie, this is the part they try to take out the movie where he's I'm coming home, to where he gets saved. And they was like, and Robert Townsend's like, this is the most important part of the movie. And y'all want to take this out? The scene with the little girl and they sang, and they want to take that out. They, from the beginning, hey, we don't need this. We don't need this part. We don't need this part. We don't need this part. And then after people saw the movie, they say, hey, that's my favorite scene in the movie. That's right. It's my favorite scene in the movie. So for Robert Townsend to have that persistence to get this Black classic out there that's important, made them want to do the Temptations movie a few years later. And I just want to give him his flowers for giving us that Black positivity that's not necessarily shoot 'em up, bang, bang. You could say the Meteor Man was corny, whatever. It was black excellence. You could say the Parenthood was corny, whatever. It was black excellence. You could say the 5 Heartbeats was corny. It was black excellence. And people like him who went against those stereotypes in Hollywood, I believe is important.
Last thing for me, which camera is mine? This one. Rhapsody. She put out an album 2 weeks ago, last week, one of the two. Phenomenal album. 22 songs. It might be one skip on there if you're not into that. But outside of that, there's no skips, and it's a cohesive album because Rhapsody is 41, and you don't know much about her. And this album, you get to know she strips everything. So I mean, it's even a line in there where she talks about, you know, her wearing baggy jeans and wearing Jordans, and people think that because she dressed like that, she likes females. Mm-hmm. She was like, no, I like niggas. Like, so it's stuff on this album that, you know, you didn't know about Rhapsody. And the intro starts with her going into, and you said all the time, the barbershop is like therapy for black people. She goes into a beauty salon, and it's almost like the beautician is her therapist. And she's talking about her hair, but what she's really talking about is herself. So then at the end of the album, she goes back in, and the beautician tells her, I know you're not here to get your hair done. She was like, nah, I just want to show you the growth in my hair. But she's not talking about her hair. Right. She's talking about her. Mm-hmm. And the beautician just starts giving her things, you know, little gems about life lessons, and you have to go. It's a phenomenal album. Salute to her, because like you just said, it's not the shoot 'em up, bang, bang drug. Is all cohesive rapping, and it just tells a story. And one of the stories that it tells is her grandmother has Alzheimer's, and she's on the phone with her. It's a skit. She's on the phone with her. I can't remember if it's a skit or if it's. That's why this album, you can't skip the song because she has skits at the end of them. Yeah, and it's her grandma talking. And she like, you know, right now, I don't know who's on the phone. But, you know, she knew it was Rhapsody just by the things that she said after that. And Rap said, you know, I'll talk to you later, Grandma. I'm going to call you more. And her grandma was like, you know, I would love that. Just those personal things that Rap put on his album. And I can't say that it won't win a Grammy because you just seen what Killer Mike album did. Yeah. But for me right now, this is album of the year. This is album of the year for me. Phenomenal body of work.
That's what's up. About to check it out. We appreciate y'all. We love y'all. Peace.
Yeah.